All right, welcome everyone back to Sister Science Stories. Today we are going to start talking about the transition to spring. And I know here in Canada we sort of feel like this transition is always a little bit irritating. We're impatient with it because spring doesn't show up here um, very sweetly. It takes its sweet time to show up here. You guys are going to remember my guest, Hannah Levin. Hannah and I had a conversation in a previous episode about the season of winter, about Vata season. And so we loved it. It was such a great chat. So I've invited Hannah back again. And today we're going to talk about Kapha season and how Kapha shifts us into spring. So welcome, Hannah. Thanks so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Jill, and I'm excited for this conversation.
I know. So kick us off. Let's talk about what is kapha and why is it coming here in springtime?
Yeah, so Kapha is one of the Ayurvedic doshas made up of the elements of earth and water. So it's a grounding force, and it's really what provides structure and lubrication and nutrition, kind of that nourishing underlying support that's in the body. It's what shows up in our environment in the spring because there's the thawing of the ice or the snow, which turns into water. And then there's uh-oh, did I just freeze?
No, you're good on my end.
Okay, sorry. Okay, there's water that comes from the melt, and then there's earth, which starts to be awakened by a little bit of warming, but it's not like hot out yet. It's
Mhm.
just like a little less cold.
Yeah.
So it's like cool and wet. And then those qualities of the cold and the wetness show up in our bodies. And
Yeah.
that's really interesting. So we have this shift from what we talked about before, the Vata season that comes prior is like dry and rough and cold. And then we have this shift. There's still this cold, but it's more cool quality. And then it's like wet instead
Yeah.
of dry and kind of
There's something
rainy.
where we live that it's almost pacifying for most people when it starts to happen because our winter up here is so long. And so those cold, hard, dry qualities of Vata, they really like take hold up here. And then this shift to spring, there's a relief that comes with that in our bodies. And as those Vata qualities sort of release, and the kapha qualities increase, you can feel that relief in your body. And I mean, Ayurveda would talk about that natural rhythm of that happening. And I do think that kind of relief is the rise of the kapha qualities of just sort of there's a little bit more hydration, there's a little bit more softness, a little bit more nourishment in the air, in the spring qualities that are happening. Does that experience happen down where you live too?
Yes, but I think it happens earlier. So for us, it's late winter when
Yeah,
that shift happens. And so by this point in time, we're a little more, we've been in the kapha for a little bit. Yeah.
right.
So it's
Yeah.
not so
And
much
we're
when
still
spring arises.
we're still we're still sitting with our fingers crossed, hoping that it's going to be soon.
Yeah.
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 And back to that point, like being from like each each doshic presence basically prepares us for the next doshic shift. And and so it's like what we're leaving behind, we're like so kind of like over it.
Yeah.
We're over being cold and dry and rough and and then we get into this place where there's a relief. I mean, same thing I think happens going from kapha season into pitta season, which is what we're going into next after kapha. And that really is like the just this cycle of doshic qualities that we're traveling through in the seasons. It's like they prepare us for the next, and we draw from where we're coming from with hopefully, I mean, when we're living in alignment with these elements, that we're like bringing with us the strengths from what we've been through. And then there's the relief, like you mentioned, of like, oh, thank goodness it's not so dry anymore or not as cold. And that is really beautiful to start to witness, because then we can really like get excited about like, oh, it's coming. And then these are the things I want to keep with me, that are like helpful in the journey. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you're alluding to a few of the sort of Ayurveda and yoga tools of the trade, where we would call it like our habits and our anchor practices, and also how those need to shift as we shift into the seasons. So as we go into this spring season, what do you know usually is part of the shifting part? What are we bringing with us that still serves us well? And what do you feel like starts to change?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe can we talk first about the qualities of
Yeah,
kapha
go
and
there
how
first.
they, does that feel okay to structure that? So kapha, the qualities, or what we can call gunas in Sanskrit, are that it's cool, cloudy, heavy, static, soft, and dense. And so everything that I just said is opposite of Vata except for the cool part.
Yeah.
So naturally, when we come into kapha season, we'll have this buildup of gunk from the winter. Because in the wintertime, we're dealing with a lot of lightness. And so we're eating heavier foods. Then we shift into kapha season, and the environment is more heavy earth and water. And we balance that with bringing in the lightness. So we can bring some of that lightness from the Vata season prior, but how we're behaving needs to shift in balance to what's happening with the outside environment. Depending on how balanced we are, we will either feel healthy cravings towards things like spring cleaning, like cleaning out our houses and doing a gentle detox for our bodies and our schedules, and kind of reevaluating what we're spending our time doing and all the stuff that we have, which is cleaning out the gunk. If we're
Mhm.
not balanced and maybe not so aware of these elements and how they have influence over us, we might be more in the tendency of becoming even more lethargic and like sleeping more and eating heavy foods, even though we need to be lightening things up now. And so it really comes back to this individual awareness. And I don't really want to make it sound like you're enlightened or not. It's not so much like that. But in Ayurveda, we really look at these three questions of for who, when, and how much. So depending on your individual constitution, you know, what it takes to balance during this time of the year will look a little bit different. However, being in the know of this pretty big shift in what the environment is providing for us, and then how we can engage with our food and our daily schedules and things like that, really makes a huge difference.
And this is one of the biggest lessons of Ayurveda. Like it just continues to say to us, yeah, you have to shift and change as these seasons shift and change, as the qualities that we are experiencing around us in our climate shift and change. There is a felt sense in our own bodies. And Ayurveda will flat out say the two things that affect how you feel the most are your personal dosha and then the season that you're in. And when we are in these transitions, it's sort of when everything feels the most wobbly. And in Canada, spring is a really wobbly season because of how slowly it arrives here and how eagerly we await it and how many kind of false starts we feel like we have. And so when you're talking about either sort of the healthy cravings And I do believe that there's an intuitive response that has us, packing up the snow clothes and putting away the toques and mitts. And we kind of joke up here that whoever put away their toques and mitts first, they're the Murphy's Law reason why we got the next snowstorm and things like that. But we have this craving in our bodies if we are paying attention to it to sort of open the doors and clean out the windows and tidy up rooms and lighten our diet, because all winter that heavy nourishing kind of casserole type foods have been what we've craved and needed to keep us in balance. And if we're still baking the lasagna and choosing that for dinner, we're missing the point of these new cravings, because this season is asking us to sort of those fresh greens that are they starting to pop out of the ground where you are? The first greens of spring? Yeah.
Yes, and we cultivate wild greens and on our homestead, and so we now have nettles, stinging nettles that are growing, and those are some of the best fresh, first spring greens that are so iron rich, and they're natural antihistamines and great for allergy season. We can talk more about them later too. And dandelion too, which is a great liver cleanser, helps with, bile production and kind of clearing out the stagnation that may have built up. Yeah, and you mentioned the kind of like stop and start. I think that happens probably everywhere. It's just at a different time. We've had that a lot, like kind of moving like, oh, today it's winter again. Now it's spring. Now it's winter again.
Mhm.
And so I like to think about it kind of as the weaving together, or like kind of the zigzagging back and forth between the seasons that stitches them together, until we're more predominantly in one season. And I think with climate change, there's also a lot of just wonky weather. The weather patterns are getting more extreme. And so while we're practicing Ayurveda, which like we've learned about these seasonal patterns that have been in play for thousands and thousands of years, we also need to be in conversation with what is actually happening today, right?
Yeah.
And so if it's a dry, windy, bright day, we're not going to be, doing all of these like drying, energy elevating practices. We need to be like very aware of, we can never go on autopilot. It's
Well, that's
important.
the and that's the invitation of Ayurveda, to always be in tune with that need, because you'll feel it in yourself. You're like, oh, actually, today I do want that big cup of soup. Like, it. The way you were describing nettles, and the nettles and the dandelions are some of the first things that start to grow here too. And I just want to point out just the idea, like think of the texture and the taste of the nettle. There is a bitterness to it. There's like even the word nettle, there's pokiness, there's pokiness to it. And a dandelion, like there's an idea around these foods that already there's a bitter astringency. The other word is pungent. And we've come from a season where salty, sour, and sweet foods have like really nourished us and sort of grounded us. And we're going to a season where that kind of cleaning action that we're feeling we want in our environments, our body wants it too. And you can think of these foods like nettles and dandelions as like these little scrub brushes as they go through your system. They're just getting rid of like that kind of extra that we held on to all winter through the winter season. And now it's going, yeah, we can scrub all this out and we can clean it out. And nettles and dandelions, I love that you mentioned them so quick, because they are an invitation to start that cleansing system in the body.
Yeah. And nature knows,
And
right?
nature
Nature is
knows.
so brilliant, and we have so much to learn. Like if we just notice what plants are showing up in the environment at any time of the year, they have a lot to teach us about what we need. And our microbiome is changing with each season. And so if we're not in alignment, if we're just going to the grocery store and we can get anything we want any time of the year from any season in some other part of the world, then we're not really aligned with the seasonal support that's available for our microbiome, and it will wear us down. If we're eating lots of things that are out of season, out of alignment with where we are in the rhythm of the year, we're not going to stay in really radiant health. And I also have this image that I teach a lot when we're understanding kapha. It's like at the beginning of the season, where if we think about like the ice melting coming down from the mountains, um, in this environmental landscape kind of picture, if we have water that doesn't have a channel to run in, it will stagnate. So earth and water come together, and when they're mixed together, they create mud, which is very cloudy, but also very fertile. But if there's just water that is showing up but doesn't have anywhere to go, then it like creates a bog basically, where it's like sitting and the earth is sitting and it can kind of get stinky and putrid and not really um, support what we need. Whereas if we have structure from the earth that's creating basically like river banks or stream banks, and then when the water melts and arrives, it has a channel to flow in, that is really what we're looking to cultivate. And I think that that is a great image for us to keep in mind as we're understanding what we need in our lives at this point in the year. Is like we need the structure that says this is the channel to flow in. We're not just like, whatever, right? And that's the beauty of kapha, is it's the dosha of structure. And so we need to bring in the earth to create the banks of the river. We need the water to have a clear channel to flow in, so that there is flow, that there's movement, and that we can be sorry, in this current that is helping us travel through this time. Because if we get really lethargic and heavy and dense, then we're just gonna kind of become part of the mucky bog.
Mhm. Well, and as we're sort of saying how the relief of leaving one season behind. This is what it's almost like, as the kapha becomes more and more prevalent, then all of a sudden the kapha can be the qualities that start to be in excess, or they start to be aggravating. And the way you were describing that was, I was starting to think, yeah, that's what kapha feels like when it's aggravating. It feels like heavy and dense and stuck and boggy. And when we think about springtime, often will you start thinking about those spring colds that happen, or the spring allergies that happen. And that bogginess in your own body is sort of the congestion of your head and the snot and like that sort of biome, if we're talking about the microbiome. When too much kapha starts to come into your body, that's the experience of your body, is just this, like this, the way you were talking about, that water has nowhere to go, that extra, it needs a place to flow. So speak to that, just keep going on that.
Well, I do want to point out too that the flow movement has to be derived from Vata. So we're coming from Vata season into Kapha season, and Kapha, its own nature is not to move.
Yeah.
It's to be static. And so we need to pull some of that Vata forward to have this flow. So I just want to tie that in too, that kind of carry over is really helpful for us to be aware of. So, do you want to talk about stagnation and how it shows up in the body?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But I just want to say on that point of bringing flow in, it's almost like in the winter season, Vata is so busy in itself that sometimes you have to prioritize the stillness depending on your dosha. But as we move into spring, it's like you actually have to prioritize putting on those shoes and getting your butt outside and prioritize that movement, because the qualities are going to sort of be stationary, want
Right.
to be more stationary. And yeah, there's always a role for you to play in what your job is to do in that season. And you're right, our job in the kapha season is to provide that movement.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, please go into that seasonal shift around the tools.
Yeah. Well, I would say too that a lot of my clients, when they first learn Ayurveda with me, they're like, oh, no wonder I
Yes.
feel like I do like all the time. But like in the springtime, especially, they're like, I always feel horrible because I'm like, it's spring. I should feel light and energized and have all this energy, but really I just want to sleep in and I like don't really feel motivated and I have some brain fog and I don't, and then learning Ayurveda, it's like the both and, right? It's like,
Yes.
yes, that is the natural tendency will be that heaviness of the kapha and we balance it with the lightness, but when we understand that there's like this inner motivation that we have to like cheerlead ourselves into
Yes.
to get there, then we don't have to beat ourselves up and be like, something's wrong with me. I'm not feeling like light and springy. It's like, actually, it's very natural and everybody's experiencing it to a certain degree. And to the degree that you have kapha in your prakriti, your innate constitution, or in your vikriti, your imbalance, then it will have a stronger pull on you. So if you are dealing with issues of congestion or weight gain, or excess growth somewhere, or brain fog, things like that, it's gonna aggravate and exacerbate it. And so I just, again, like always feel like Ayurveda helps us be so compassionate. Like we'd be like, oh, that's why. And we're so quick to be like, something's wrong with me. I'm defective. I'm the defective one over here. Like something's wrong. And then to just be like, oh, it's the seasonal influence. That's so helpful. Like I'm not somehow flawed. And then to recognize, like, oh, yeah, if you look back on the years of your life, these patterns show up. I mean, I had started having chronic sinus infections when I was in high school. And every spring, I would just dread it. And my birthday's in April, and I'd always be like sick for my birthday. And it really wasn't until I found Ayurveda in my 30s. So think of decades of like being miserable with allergies. And I don't have a lot of kapha in my constitution, but I would get very kapha imbalanced in the spring, probably because the Vata imbalance would be so strong during Vata season. And then it would just carry over more imbalance, right? And so learning Ayurveda was like, oh, like now I have like a little bit of seasonal allergies. I'll be like, my eyes are a little itchy or whatever. And I'll be like, boop, like no worries. I got this.
And
So
this is where it gets so interesting because if like as soon as you learn Ayurveda, you have these tools that you can bring some of that balance into your body so the kapha doesn't sort of come in and take over. And as you understand that, oh, I see what's happening here. There's some kapha coming in. And if you're like, okay, I know how to balance this, then your body doesn't have to sort of go react to or be affected by that energy that's coming from nature quite as much. So you might be able to offset that kapha quality coming in and really taking hold in your body because you're like, oh, I know that when spring comes, I have to lighten up my food and I have to move differently and I have to still creating heat the way we created heat all winter long, but there might be a little bit of a different energy around it now. So the more we understand how to do this for ourselves, the less we are like when people say that, oh, every year that happens to me. And I know you're similar to me in that you like people to sort of be with you, witnessing themselves in each season so that they can understand what those personal takeaways are of how their body and the season weave themselves together so they can understand what practices are most beneficial.
absolutely. Yes, because we are constantly in conversation with the natural world, whether we like it or not.
Whether we
But
like it.
once we recognize it, then we can be like, oh, this is my friend,
Yeah.
and this is my teacher, and I can learn to live in abundant well-being the whole year round. I don't have to struggle and suffer. But seeing how we have tended to struggle and suffer will be very insightful as you learn more. And I think, both of us in the programs that we run really empower people to listen to the signals from their bodies before they get so loud that there's a lot of backtracking that we need to do. So that deep listening of like, oh, I'm feeling a little stuffy today, or I have a little headache, or my digestion slowed down a bit. Like, those are great things to start noticing. They're not going to be like ruin your day types of things usually, but if we can catch them at that point and be like, oh, what's needed to kind of bring things back into the channels, bring things back into balance, then that's really, really helpful. So we were talking about like issues of stagnation or congestion. So this can show up in certainly mucus in the head, in the nose, postnasal drip, um, even like sinus headaches, things like that, that accumulate. A lot of clearing of the throat, kind of stuff like that. You'll hear people doing a lot this season. And that's just indication that there's more congestion in the system. We might also find that we have more congestion that shows up in the stool too, like even mucus that's in the stool. And also sluggish digestion and elimination. So you might eat a meal and then feel like it's sitting like a rock in your stomach. Um, and so this like slow, cloudy, sluggish, um, mucusy accumulation can show up in lots of different ways. And allergies are one thing that can show up a lot. So the lungs are a secondary doshic site for kapha. And so the respiratory system is one that we want to tend to during this season. Like I would say just everybody, regardless of if you're having an issue or not. So some things that we could do to support the respiratory system are to use a neti pot to clear out the sinuses. And I also recommend using nausea, which I really recommend people doing in the Vata season. So that's putting oil in our nose. And that just moisturizes the mucosal membranes in the nose. In Kapha season, the oil that we put in our nose acts a little bit more like an aid to the hairs that are in our nose to help strain out any pollutants or pollens or allergens. And so it makes them even more sticky, and it can help us not have so much coming into the body, especially if the mucosal membranes are dry. Our bodies do not do well with dry mucosal membranes. So if we can keep doing nausea in the spring, that's really helpful. And so often I recommend to do like nausea in the morning and then neti in the evening. So there's this rinsing out before going to bed, and then in the morning, nausea again. So that can be really helpful. Also, doing ginger steams is really helpful. So that's basically making a strong ginger tea, like chopping up fresh ginger, boiling it in a pot of water for like 15 minutes, taking it off the stove, setting it, on a counter or a table, putting a towel over your head, putting your head over the pot, and breathing in through your nose. The steam and the ginger is very drying, and it's drawing too, so it'll help pull out excess mucus. And so the idea is you might end up, if you have a lot of congestion, kind of letting it drain out into the pot or the bowl or whatever. And you might also end up hacking up some phlegm, some congestion there too. Do you have things you want to add to that, Jill?
And clear the lungs. No,
Yeah.
I think it's lovely to consider that there's things that you can do that are really sweet and natural and helpful. And I know that one of the practices that I'll get if things start to feel in springtime, that those allergens can make my eyes feel itchy. And if that happens to me, then I've got this rose water and an eye cup, and I spray the rose water into the eye cup, and then I just tip it over my eyeball and blink a few times, hang out, and then I will do the same and repeat it on the other side because that just feels like things soothe. Um, we live in where I am in Canada in quite a dry climate. So the nausea is something that here you can do definitely through this kapha season. And I see it almost as it almost also creates this barrier. If you think of like that heavy snottiness just sort of like taking hold, I feel like the nausea is like a non-stick pan. Like it just creates a little bit of a layer here where it's like this stuff will drain out easier if it's in a non-stick pan. It'll clear and clean out easier if you're in the non-stick pan. And that's what I feel like the nausea does is it gives that sinus area and the inside of your nostrils a little bit more of that non-stick.
I love that analogy. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What other tools do you think are good for this feeling? That was the congestion. What about the idea of the sluggishness or the being weighed down? What other
Yeah.
practices do you notice are the most beneficial in this season?
Well, one that I think is just hands down a great practice year round, but especially during kapha season, is to wake up before the sunrise. And so the kapha energy can also be what we could correlate with depression. And in Ayurveda, one of the um, traditional treatments for depression is to walk toward the rising sun. And even if you're not walking towards the rising sun, waking up before the sunrise, especially in kapha season, is extremely helpful for that energizing ability. So always our energy can build with the solar energy, and that's especially important during kapha season because if we sleep past the sunrise, that heavy quality of the kapha time of the day is going to be even heavier for us.
Mm.
So waking up before the sunrise, moving our bodies early is great, and definitely before eating something in the morning. And you were mentioning earlier, like different types of movement practices for different times of the year. And this is the time of year to exercise the hardest.
Yeah,
It's like move the most energy, get your breath really pumping, and sweat. It's
sweat.
it's important this time of year for all of us. And again, like the more kapha you have in your constitution or imbalance, the more this is all going to be true for you. Um, and so, yeah, getting heat built in the body and sweating. Um, and also drinking warm water throughout the day, I think is really key this time of year. Um, I think there's a tendency when we start moving out of winter per se that we're like, oh, now we can have like cooler foods. And it's really important to keep things warm because the stagnation that comes into the channels of our body, again, back to that river analogy, like we really need to keep the channels open, not be like the cold will clog things up. And so having warm water, just being like what we're sipping on all day long, having a bunch in the morning, having another big chug in the middle of the afternoon away from meals, really, really helpful. But having this kind of like warm, um, liquid that just helps melt the stagnation throughout the day is just it's a game changer. It's
It is
it's
a game
really a
changer.
game
There
changer.
is, if you wanted to actually make it into a tea for this season, one of the Ayurvedic ones recommended for spring is CCF, and it's just cumin, coriander, and fennel. Is that what you've got? Yeah, and
This
it's
yeah.
basically have a big flask like Hannah's got, and then it's a teaspoon each of fennel, coriander, and cumin, and it's seeds, and you can put them in your mortar and pestle, and you can sort of squirt them around. But I find that you don't even really need to. You can just throw them in your cup and drink that. And they've got, like, if you think about how nettles taste, like, you know how sometimes food tastes like really healthy, tastes like this tastes like if it's green. That's how this tea kind of tastes. It's got that astringent, bitter, pungent kind of taste to it, but you can tell it's going in and just like cleaning things. That's how it feels. And you're right. That's what we want for this season. Yeah. I
Yeah.
love when you were talking about waking for the sunrise. And we have sort of we have I'm going to call it an issue that happens to us up here in the north is that our sunrise gets earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. So it's easy to get up before sunrise in wintertime. And as we go towards June 21st, it gets harder to get up before sunrise. But we're in a sweet spot still where it's easy enough to get up before the sun rises for the next month or so. And then it starts to be impossible. But take advantage of that right now because not only do these qualities have a seasonal shift, but they have a daily shift. So when Hannah's saying like it becomes really hard to get up if you try and get up once after the sun's risen, we can all remember days like that where we wake up before the sun rises and we've got energy and things feel light and if we would let ourselves get up, it would be fine, but we look at the clock and we're like, no, I'm going to snooze. And then when you snooze and you fall asleep, then when you try and get up, it feels like you're pushing yourself against gravity to try and get out of bed. And that's the quality you're talking about. It gets really hard then to sort of lift yourself up when the Vata qualities of the morning, or sorry, the Kapha qualities of our morning are just like getting us to be stationary. And that's why this is the time of year where the warm, sweaty workouts and the early rising and yeah, that during doing those morning and evening can be really beneficial to balancing the kapha qualities.
Yeah. And even doing things that are um, a little more air infused. I'm thinking specifically of like doing rebounder workouts or things like that, where you're not so attached to the, or like even our bodies can just, I mean, even if we're not necessarily carrying excess weight, we can just feel kind of heavy.
Yeah.
And so doing like I did a rebounder workout this morning and it's just so funny to be like, oh wow, that type of movement feels very enlivening and lightens things up because I'm bouncing in a way that for me being Vata predominant, bouncing that much in Vata season would feel kind of deranging, right? But like this season, it feels very supportive. Yeah. So that's just an example.
And I
That's
love that because I think that more and more we have to remind ourselves that there's a season for everything.
right.
That they're like right now would be the time up here that people might be getting their trampolines out again or something like that. If your kids have a trampoline, go bounce on it right now. Yeah,
Yeah.
notice how that feels. Yeah, I love it. I'm wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. And I was going to say too, back to the CCF, like I'm drinking a version of CCF right now. And CCF that's the cumin coriander fennel tea that Joe was just talking about. And it can be a little over drying for folks that tend towards dryness, either Vata predominant or in Vata stage of life. That's post-menopause for women. And so adding some other things into it can be really helpful. So what I'm drinking here is a CCF that also has some licorice root in it, which is a demulcent, which helps keep moisture, add moisture in. It also has dashmula, which is a mixture of 10 roots that are very grounding, again, for Vata. It has fresh ginger and cardamom. And both of those are tasty, but they're also digestive aids. So the CCF in and of itself is very helpful for gently rekindling the digestive fire without aggravating pitta and cleansing the tissues. It can be a little too drying though. So I like making kind of like embellished CCF sometimes. And then, so seeds and roots you can boil. So
Okay.
everything that I just mentioned, I put into a pot and boiled for like 10 to 15 minutes. Then I turn the heat off and then I add the leaves and stalks that can steep. So then I put in nettles and mullein. And mullein is specifically helpful for the lungs and the respiratory system. So, and those we grow on our homestead. So we just dry them and then we have them through the winter and the spring. So in this tea that I'm drinking right now is a whole bunch of different herbs that are helping me do all sorts of things that are really helpful for kapha season. Manage allergies, kindle my digestive fire, cleanse my tissues, right? Like
Yeah.
all these things. And so it can be really fun. This is back to like Ayurveda, like food is medicine, using herbs. Like I could go to the store and, get, I don't know, Allegra D or something. I probably don't need that at this point, but like an allergy medication, right? Or a decongestant. But like I don't need those things now because I have these herbal allies and this way to make a tea that's really supportive for me to drink, and drinking it daily. It needs to build up in your system too. So don't drink it once and then be like, oh, that didn't help.
Inward. Yeah. And the other thing that the way you're describing that, and that's the way you're describing it is sort of one of the points that I want to highlight as a benefit of Ayurveda. And that is that the whole point of learning Ayurveda is to learn you and to then understand in yourself what you might need. So when you're talking about, I can just picture you sort of standing in front of your herbs and deciding what's going to go in your tea. And you're not deciding what's going to go in your tea, it sounds like, based on some recipe that's in front of you. You're deciding what's going to go in your tea based on how your body feels. So you're noticing, oh, I want something that's a little bit less drying, or I want something that's still going to, and you're very Vata. So when you say things can get dry, anyone who has Vata in their system, or like we're saying for where we live in Canada, comes from a very Vata climate, you might find that you need to always be adding things that you're like, I don't want to dry out too much because I already feel dry. And I love that you're choosing things in response to a natural conversation that you're having with your body. And that is the invitation of Ayurveda, is to come into that conversation with your body and make any decision, whether it's what kind of tea you're going to make or what you're going to eat for dinner, what time you're going to get up, what kind of exercise you're going to do today. You're making that decision based on a conversation with your body, not some sort of external rule.
Yeah. Yes. Amen. Hallelujah to all of that. Exactly. And I think that's really challenging. I mean, I think we both talk about this a lot, especially as women, that it's really challenging to tune into like what feels good to me, because we're so used to being like, well, what works for everybody else and how can I, not have needs basically. But the less we are in contact with our own needs and inner alignment, the more we are drained and we're not able to actually show up as our brilliant, vibrant selves. And it impacts our generosity. Like we end up being resentful and depleted, and right. It's like we're not able to be the vibrant women that we are. And so that goes back to self-care is the least selfish thing you could ever do. It's in service to the greater good of everybody in your life. And that tuning into, I mean, as you were talking, Jill, I was just thinking about how I can, yes, be with foods or herbs that I'm making a tea out of, or whatever, and I can feel like just being with them, like feel in my body, like how will that feel to like bring this, welcome it into becoming me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And nettles in particular, I started drinking nettles infusion when I was in my mid 20s. And it was when I actually went off of birth control pills. And a friend of mine who was studying to be a midwife said, this will really help you clear out the artificial hormones from your body. And lo and behold, my allergies went away. And I was like, what is going on? And I didn't draw the correlation at first. But then I went to an herbal workshop and learned, oh, nettles is really helpful for allergies. But nettles has become, I would say, hands down, is my top herbal ally. Like it has healed me so much. It has more calcium than milk. It's got your leafy green B vitamins. It's rich in iron. It's just such an amazing plant. And I now really dial in drinking my nettles tea this time of year. And when I drink it, it just feels like every cell in my body is singing. It's like, yay, we have the support that we need, and it just, when we have that type of relationship with our own healing through what we're bringing into our bodies, I mean, it really is about, we can be the gatekeepers of what becomes us and our cellular intelligence, and what we say no thank you. I also know that refined sugar and dairy this time of year are really unhelpful. They will drive me into imbalance really quickly.
You can, like, I can look at a jug of milk and feel snot building in
Yes.
my body. Like, my body just goes, there's, you know exactly what that's going to feel in your body as soon as you drink that. But I think what you're inviting people now to is this relationship, because you spoke about it right at the beginning when you said, when you're aligned, your intuition will be guiding you toward being outside more, cleaning your house. Like, there's just like this spring clean urge that comes into you. And if your body is clean and clear enough, you will be feeling that intuition. And so what we are inviting you to notice also is if you're not, if you in this season of spring are feeling lethargic, heavy, depressed, like you're sleeping more, like you don't have that, then just know, like you mentioned as well, that this is the season. There's not something wrong with you. There's not something defective in your being. You are experiencing too much kapha. And so that experience can feel like that. And just know that it needs the opposite. It needs lightness. And that lightness comes in through what you do, how you eat, what you drink, all of these sorts of things. But invite yourself to notice that and reach out, because, yeah, Hannah, you work with people like this, like helping people work through these imbalances is sort of what Ayurveda does. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Give us
It's
some takeaways. What can we do? I mean, we've given people lots of takeaways, but what's anything else that we need to know to align with spring energy, to bring in some rituals or self-care practices that just um, get us through this season perfectly?
Well, I think we should touch on food a little bit more.
Okay.
We've done a lot with herbs, but really quickly, I mean, I mentioned sugar and dairy are things that generally create a lot of congestion and inflammation for people this time of year. Also, grains and baked goods are going to, so heavy foods we really just want to have minimally this time of year, and also to remind ourselves that our digestion will naturally be a little slower this time of year. We don't need as much food, and we don't need to eat as often, which is just really interesting. Like, I find myself just like kind of my inner cheerleader being a bit like you, there's just not as much need for food. And this time of year, I lead a detox, you do too, and I often will go to a two meals a day during the detox, and it just feels so good. It's like I don't need to be eating so often. And so the foods that we want to focus on, Jill, you were mentioning, is like these leafy greens that come in the spring that are more bitter. We'll have arugula, kale, chard, things like that, that are just the early crops. Eventually, we'll have peas,
Mhm.
and asparagus and things like that. We all know asparagus makes our pee smell funny, and that's part of the cleaning out. It's got a really great job to do cleaning the urinary tract, the scrota, the
Mhm.
water carrying channel. That And so these foods that naturally grow this time of year are so helpful. The fruits that will come in are going to be more sour berries, that also have some astringency to them, like blueberries, have a little bit of a drying quality. And then beans are also really helpful this time of year. They're very astringent. The larger the bean, the more astringent it's going to be. So, If you struggle with beans being gassy for you, eating smaller beans will be helpful, things like lentils or split mung dal. But if you can handle digesting beans pretty well, you could eat much bigger beans, kidney beans, chickpeas. And that those are really helpful. They are extractive too. So they're helping to cleanse your tissues. And so these foods really like beans and greens. I'm always like beans and greens, like this is the season for them, but also in correlation with who you are. You know, if you're super Vata or well past menopause, you probably don't want to go too extreme into just beans and greens.
Well, and
Having some
this
root
is where
vegetables in there can be good too.
Yeah, and this is where the relationship with your body becomes so important because we can prescribe what Ayurveda's ideal spring diet would be, and it's going to be different where you are in the southeastern states and where I am in northwestern Canada, and it's going to be different for your constitution. And so there is sort of like a yeah, increase sort of there's augmenting foods that are going to help ground and nourish you, and then there's the extracting foods that are going to help clean things out. And spring is a season where, yeah, increase those extracting foods because your body's looking to clean and clear. The same way up here, where we're thinking about shedding all the winter clothing. Our body is thinking of shedding some of the extra stuff that it held on to get us through the winter season. And now it's kind of looking around going, I think it's safe to let this go. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's natural for us to gain a little bit of weight in the winter and then lose it by the summertime. So this is kind of the season, this transitional season from the winter into the summer, where it's like that shedding that you're talking about is like, yes, let's let that go. For most people, it's going to be between 3 to 5 pounds that they'll just naturally fluctuate. That's helpful in the winter, and
Mm.
then good to shed it for the summer. And what we're really doing, kind of back to the big picture here too, is that we have gone through Vata season. We're into Kapha season now. Vata season prepared us, and then we're preparing ourselves to go into Pitta season next by how we journey through Kapha season. So if we don't clear out during this season, then we're setting ourselves up to really suffer in the summertime because we'll have basically all this insulation and stagnation in our bodies. And then we go into the heat, and that does not feel good. So we want to make sure that our channels are open. We want to make sure that we're really preparing our bodies and minds and spirits for this next season. So we're always, it's not just about where we are right now. It's about what we've come through and what we're moving towards that we want to keep in the forefront of our minds, that we're like setting ourselves up for not just an awesome spring, but a really awesome summer too.
Yeah. Oh, I just love this. Thank you. I have one final question, and that is just the idea of doing a cleanse in the spring. Are you in the middle of yours right now or just launching it?
We're starting it today.
Okay, excellent. And ours will begin after Easter.
Okay.
So tell me, like, how you frame this cleanse experience so that people understand the reason why it's so important.
Yeah. So in Ayurveda, there's a term called Rutu Sandhi, which means the joints in the seasons, basically. And you can also think of this being like a joint in a drain pipe or something. It's like where things change direction, right? So, like I was talking about before, it's like we're moving from cold to hot in the seasons right now. We're changing direction. But in this turn, this joint is where we are right now, which is the springtime, and it's where things can really get stuck, right? So back to what I was just saying before about like if we don't clean out the channels, if we don't tend to the gunk that's built up over the winter, get it cleared out, then we're going to set ourselves up for imbalance or dis-ease as we go into the next season, which is summer. And so over time, we're setting ourselves up for deeper and deeper and deeper disease states, basically. And so doing seasonal detoxes in the spring and in the autumn are like these really wonderful ways to just keep our bodies in rhythm. And it's a reset. I call mine a detox because that's what people respond to. I tried calling it a reset at one point, like nobody signed up. But really, it's a digestive reset because we need to tend to the microbiome. We need to tend to the liver. We need to come back to what's in season, what's important to us. And all of us, I start craving it every 6 months. I'm like, okay, clear out some, and I don't eat lots of junk or anything, but there's little things that creep in here and there. And I'm just like, okay, take a little break from from these things, and then have this inner reset. Part of it is tending to the microbiome, and a big part of it is just tuning back into yourself, of having this focused, supported time to be like, oh, how am I feeling? What needs attending to? How can I support myself? And it's a really, really special thing to treat yourself to twice a year, and will help
Yeah.
you live happier and healthier for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And because we're in a transitional season, the messages that our body's been sending us all winter long are changing. And so it's so helpful to make a practice of tuning into your body in a season where the trajectory of the messages, like you said, like we're making a right turn. Things were cold and now we're going towards hot. So we're intentionally setting time aside to tune in to the fact that messages are changing and asking us for something different. So therein lies almost this alignment, this falling in line with nature's rhythm. And that's what, to me, same thing, cleanse, detox, reset. Choose what word you want. What you're doing is you are aligning yourself with the rhythm of nature. And when you do that, you get to experience the bounty, ease, effortlessness, the flow, and the vibrancy that nature wants to offer you.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be complex. It
No,
really can be super simple, and you can have a lot of benefit from it. So, yeah,
absolutely.
do a
Thank you.
detox.
Yeah, absolutely. Good luck as you start yours.
Thank
Oh,
you.
I feel like I need to say we are out of time. And I feel like, as usual, we could talk forever. I almost want to invite you back to start talking to us about some of the herbs. There's something in there that could be a fun conversation.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Cool. Thank you so much for being here today. I always love our conversations and appreciate your wisdom so much.
Likewise, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
We'll speak to you soon, my friend.
Okay.